Good morning, students. I'm Ms. Isabel Besaidenhout, tutor for Educational Foundations for DPPE, DJPE, and BES. Welcome to this morning's contact-based session where we're going to highlight some of the most important aspects of this course. First of all, we start with Unit 1, the history of education and comparative education as disciplines. We might first of all ask ourselves the questions, what is the purpose of studying the history of education? As we know, we live in the present, but we always plan and worry about what will happen in the future. History, we can say, is the study of the past, and in a society that expects education to serve a useful purpose, the function of history might seem difficult to define. However, history is very useful, actually essential, but the product of historical study is sometimes less certain and less immediate than those that may originate from some other disciplines. So we can say that the main reason we study history is to help us understand people and societies. The history of education cannot directly answer routine questions in education, but it can help uncover frames of reference, guiding principles, and other theoretical aspects which routine questions always raise. We look back on the history of education, and it helps us to inform future teachers about broad educational and social policy. It also provides knowledge necessary for background, understanding, and action in education. It gives opportunity for students and teachers to learn to choose intelligent and courageous actions among unclear alternatives to practice the teaching in class. It can also be significant if it causes the student and teacher to consider the human condition, to order, to interpret, and to seek meaning in educational affairs. Another very important aspect in Unit 1 is to consider homeschooling learners. What are the issues that we need to concentrate on here? First of all, socialization is one of the most debated issues when homeschooling a learner. The question arises, does the learner develop the skills to socialize if he or she is homeschooled? Then there's the question of what curriculum to choose. There are many different curriculums and programs and methods that one can choose from, and parents may become completely confused or even scared of homeschooling. Then in most countries we have a specific curriculum that the learners must follow. Even when homeschooled, they need to follow this specific curriculum. Then comes the aspect of over and under scheduling. Even if you're at a home schooling your child, you have to have a schedule or a timetable. Some parents try to do too much in a day, and then others might be doing too little. The fourth aspect is that parents might have unrealistic expectations. They might either expect too much, so that in that case it's very important that you need to know your child's abilities and also what the areas is that he or she struggles with. Number 5 is a disorganized schoolroom. Even though you teach at home, it's very important that it's an organized area. Everything should have a place. If you want to start looking for something when it's needed, it will waste a lot of time and energy. Therefore, it's important that one ensures that everything that is needed is available before teaching begins. Then comes the issue of breaks. A child needs regular breaks so that they can take in what they need to learn. No learner can concentrate for long hours without a break. Therefore, breaks should be scheduled during the school day. The next aspect is the aspect of doing it alone. It's quite daunting to think that you must be both a parent and a teacher because it takes so much commitment, patience, and planning. You still need to be a parent, and it can become too much to handle. Everything is at home is another aspect. The parent and the learner also need to get out of the house and see different surroundings. One can become very isolated if you homeschool your child and you don't make effort to take him or her to other places as well. Then comes the input of the learner. Parents have to listen to the child as well. Sometimes they need a break, sometimes they might not understand, or sometimes it's a method that does not work. In some cases, a parent needs to learn to be more lenient, where in other cases, parents need to be stricter. So it's a fine balance, in other words. The last aspect in homeschooling is the aspect of having internet or not. It's nearly impossible to homeschool if you don't have the internet. Some people don't have access, of course, and then there are others that they don't know how it works, so they're scared to use it. People also view the internet in different ways. They can be too strict. In other words, they will not allow the child any access, or some are way too laid back when they let their children use the internet. Another very important aspect in this specific unit is the National Potsy-Condoré Education's Cooperatives Report of Competency-Based Approach. Now, I would like you to consider the diagram that you see on the slide right now. And as you can see, it builds upon the very first foundation of traits and characteristics, and then it builds up to the highest level of the pyramid, which is demonstrations. And all of this, as you can see, is assessed in certain ways. Now I'm going to describe each of these, and if you are assessed in an assignment or a test, you will also be expected to comment on each of these. The first rung, as we said, is the traits and characteristics, and that refers to the foundation of learning, and it shows the inborn makeup of individuals upon which further experiences can be built. Then, if that rung is fulfilled, we come to the second one, which is the skills, the abilities, and the knowledge, which is developed through learning experiences, broadly defined to include formal education, work, and participation in community affairs. The third rung refers to competencies. That is the outcome of integrated learning experiences in which skills, abilities, and knowledge are focused on the performance of a task. And then finally we come to the top rung, which is the results from the application of the competencies. Now, as we saw, we particularly need to refer to assessment as well here. Assessment is deeply embedded at all the stages of this learning process. It is clear, given this description, that the design of the learning experiences is dependent upon the following: standardized and agreed upon definitions for skills, abilities and knowledge, competencies and demonstrations. Once there is an agreement upon competencies that must be mastered, it opens up avenues or new ways for learners to personalize their learning options. This brings us to Unit 2, which is titled The Contribution of Selected Historical Figures. The first historical figure that I would like to focus on is Plato. An appropriate way to regard his educational prescriptions in his book The Republic is as recommendations for developing moral reason in the individual. He was insistent that a premature attempt to get children to reason for themselves only serves to make them rebellious and disrespectful of traditional wisdom. Therefore, in the earlier sections of this book, which discusses the cultural and physical education of the young, Plato defends the notion or the idea that education is a training of character above all else. He also believed that there should be close direction of the child's educational environment, especially in the very early years, when the child absorbs every impression that anyone wishes to stamp upon it. He felt it was necessary to counteract those pressures, including the sensual appetites that threaten to smother the inborn, yet fragile tendency for reason. Also, he felt direction was needed in a more positive way to require, if the young is to acquire those affective characteristics such as love of grace and elegance that are required for the eventual appreciation of the beauty of reason. It does not matter that, for a considerable time, the young person has no conscious, rational grasp of why things are beautiful or good. He believed the urgent task was to develop a character which would be open to, and indeed eager for insight and mental clarity. If we look at today's education, what is the relevance of Plato's view? For informal educators, we can look at it at a number of different levels. First of all, Plato believed that educators must have a deep care for the well-being and future of those they work with. He felt that education was a moral enterprise and it was the duty of the educator to search for truth and virtue and to guide those that have a responsibility to teach. Secondly, he believed in the Socratic teaching method, where the teacher should know his or her subject. As a true philosopher, he should also know the limits of his or her knowledge. And in this we see the power of dialogue that he believed in. He felt that the joint exploration of a subject was important and that knowledge does not just come from teaching, but from questioning. Thirdly, was Plato's conceptualization of the differing educational requirements associated with the various life stages. He believed in the classical Greek concern for body and mind, the importance of exercise and discipline, storytelling, and games. This is how we saw the different stages that man goes through. At 6, they enter school, where they learn to read, write, and count, and engage in music and sports. And this path would then follow up to where the person reaches an age of 50. At 18, the person undergoes military and physical training. At 21, the student would enter higher studies. At 30, begin to study philosophy and serve the polis in the army or the civil service. And then he felt at 50, they were ready to rule. This was his model that we now describe as lifelong education. It's also a model for a learning society. The polis is serviced by educators, and it can only exist as a rational form if its members are trained and continue to grow. Now we look at our second historical figure, William Spidy. There were two main concerns that drove his early work on educational reform. One was the future that school children were facing, and then the fundamental character of the education system that was preparing them for the future. Spidy described the American education system as educentric. Educentric means the operation and thinking of those who guide education and worked in it were driven primarily by what was and always had been, rather than by what could and should be. He also focused on outcome-based education, and he saw it as the following: a means of organizing for results, basing what we do instructionally on the outcomes we want to achieve. Outcome-based education practitioners thus start by determining the knowledge, the competencies and the qualities that they want students to be able to demonstrate when they finish school and face the challenges of the adult world. Then they design curricula and instructional systems that they believe will produce these exit outcomes. Outcome-based education is not a program, but a way of designing, developing, delivering, and documenting instruction in terms of its intended goals. The third philosopher I want to look at is Nyerere, and his view of adult education is of particular importance. He saw it as anything which enlarges men's understanding, activated them, helped them to make their own decision, and to implement those decisions for themselves. It also includes the concepts of agitation, organization, and mobilization. He felt that there were two types of educators involved in education. The first would be the generalists. They were the community development workers, the political activists, and the religious teachers. And they were not politically neutral, and they could affect how people look at society, in the society in which they live, and how they seek to use or change it. Then there were also the specialists, or are also the specialists, those who are concerned with health, agriculture, childcare, management, and literacy. Nyerere believed that adult education did not have a beginning or an end, and it should not be pressed into self-contained compartments. Rather, we should think of it as lifelong learning. He also always believed that living is learning, and learning is about trying to live better. For him, in terms of method, two aspects stood out. Educators do not give something they possess to another. They help their learner to develop their own potential and capacity. Those that your educators work with have experience and knowledge about the subjects they are interested in, although they may not realize it. By drawing out what the learner already knows and showing their relevance to the new thing to be learned, the teacher does three things. He builds the confidence of the man who wants to learn by showing he is capable of contributing. Secondly, he demonstrates the relevance of experience and observation as a method of learning when combined with thought and analysis. And thirdly, he shows the mutuality of learning, which means that by sharing our knowledge, we extend the totality of our understanding and our control over our lives. Another important aspect I want to concentrate on in this unit is let's differentiate. In other words, let's look at the differences between competency-based education and a mastery learning approach to instruction and assessment. So first of all, let's consider competency-based education. It's a general term applied to instructional and assessment efforts aimed at defining and evaluating student performance. So you note that it strongly focuses on the student's performance. Mastery learning, on the other hand, is a form of individualized instruction in which students are allowed the time necessary to master each unit of the curriculum before they proceed to the next. A definition of mastery learning could be, in essence, it is an instructional process which involves organizing instruction, providing students with regular feedback on their learning progress, giving them guidance and direction to help them correct their individual learning difficulties, and then also providing extra challenges for students who have mastered the material. This brings us to Unit 3. Unit 3 is titled The International Historical Development of Pre-Primary Education, and I'm going to highlight two articles of the Conventions of the Rights of the Child. The first one is Article 28, referring to the state parties recognizing the right of the child to education. And this is what the article states: with a view to achieving this right progressively and on the basis of equal opportunity, they shall in particularly make primary education compulsory and available free to all, make higher education accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, make educational and vocational information and guidance available and accessible to all children. D. Take measures to encourage regular attendance at school and the reduction of dropout rates. Furthermore, or in the second place, state parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that school discipline is administered in a manner consistent with a child's human dignity in conformity with the present convention. And in the third place, state parties shall promote and encourage international cooperation in matters relating to education, in particularly with a view to contributing to the elimination of ignorance and illiteracy throughout the world and facilitating access to scientific and technical knowledge and modern teaching methods. In this regard, particular account shall be taken of the needs of developing countries. Then I also want to focus on Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. State parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to A. The development of the child's personality, talents, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. B. development of respect for human rights and fundamental freedom, and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. C. The development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. D. The preparation of the child for responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of sex and friendship among all peoples, ethnic, national and religious group and persons of indigenous origin, and also the development of respect for the natural environment. Also part of this unit, of this chapter, is that we should be on the lookout to see that these rights of the child is actually respected. And this brings us to what are the guidelines which we as educators should consider in order to protect the rights of the child. First of all, we must be on the lookout for the signs of child abuse. Also recognize that neglecting a child is also a form of abuse. In the third place, any evidence of abuse or neglect has to be reported to a local child protected service or to the police. In the fourth place, authorities must be notified if any child is segregated or denied educational opportunities based on race, color, national origin, sex, or disability. If the previous steps are not successful, other agencies should be found to complain to and take the matter further. And in the sixth place, distinguish accessibility to education from receiving an equal education. This brings us now to our professional freedom. What is the principle of professional freedom for educators? The teaching profession should enjoy academic freedom in the discharge of professional duties. As teachers are particularly qualified to judge teaching aids and methods that are suitable, they should play an essential role in the choice and the adaptation of teaching materials, the selection of textbooks, and the application of teaching methods, of course within a framework that's approved and with the assistance of educational authorities. Teachers and the organization should also participate in the development of new courses, textbooks and teaching aids, and any systems of inspection or supervision should be designed to encourage and help teachers in the performance of their professional tasks and should not be there to diminish the freedom, the initiative and the responsibility of teachers. Furthermore, direct assessment of the teacher's work should be objective and should be made known to the teacher. Teachers should have a right to appeal against assessments which they deem to be unjustified. They should be free to make use of such evaluation techniques as they may deem useful for the appraisal of pupils' progress, and they should ensure in the same hand that no unfairness to individual pupils results. Authorities should give due weight to the recommendations of teachers regarding the suitability of individual pupils for courses and further education of different kinds. Every possible effort to promote close cooperation between teachers and parents in the interest of people should be made. Teachers should be protected against unfair or unwarranted interference by parents in matters which are essentially the teacher's professional responsibility. Furthermore, parents having a complaint against a school or a teacher should first have the opportunity to discuss it with the school principal and the teacher concerned before the complaint is taken to a higher authority. And if it is done so, it should be done in writing and a copy should be supplied to the teacher. Investigations of complaints should be so conducted that the teachers are given a fair opportunity to defend themselves and no publicity should be given to the proceedings. While teachers should exercise the utmost care to avoid accidents to pupils, employers of teachers should also safeguard them against the risk of having damages assessed against them in the event of injury to pupils occurring at the school or activities away from the school premises or grounds. Of particular importance, and it goes hand in hand with the previous section, is what is the relation between teachers and the education service as a whole with regard to the teacher's rights and responsibilities. To ensure that teachers do not discharge their responsibilities, the authority should establish and regularly use recognized means of consultation with teachers' organizations on matters such as educational policy, school organization, and new developments in the education service. Authorities and teachers should recognize the importance of the participation of teachers through their organizations and in other ways in steps designed to improve the quality of the education service in educational research and in the development and distribution of new improved methods. In addition, authorities should facilitate the establishment and the work of panels designed within a school or within a broader framework. This should be done to promote the cooperation of teachers of the same subject and should also take into account the opinion and the suggestions of such panels. In the last place, administrative and other staff members who are responsible for aspects of the education service should seek to establish good relations with teachers, and this approach should be equally shared. We go over to Unit 4, titled Features and Effects of Colonial Education on the Namibian People. And the first aspect that stands out is that of the religious education, which was utilized by the German colonizers who conquered the territory in 1884 and used as a means of colonization and racial segregation. We see that at this stage, indigenous people were only provided with well-calculated, limited skills, which was done to ensure that they would remain manual workers and thus provide cheap labor to the whites at that stage. Eventually, reserves were created for the indigenous people, and the colonial government still paid no attention to the establishment of adequate schools for them. So it became clear throughout the history of colonialism that the Germans were not interested in educating the natives, but rather in trading and making money. Education was used as an instrument of oppression during these years, as well as in the apartheid rule in Namibia. During Germany's colonial rule, schools were only built for white people. Later, the German administration did, however, ensure that there was a kind of training available, but only so that it could serve their means. Because they needed a source for servants and laborers, African education was still designed to keep them inferior, and it was also designed to avoid inculcating ideas like democracy, human freedom, and the like. So they were only educated to a certain level in order to serve the means of the colonialism. In 1909, German authorities introduced organized education for the white population. However, little changed for the indigenous population because they were not yet seen as being necessary for the country's economic development, so they were not provided with any education. Like the German authorities, the missionaries didn't want to risk giving the indigenous population education that might result, as we said, in ideas of democracy and equality. But for them to establish Christian communities, they had to at least teach the people to read and write. So that's why they founded some primary schools in small scattered communities around the country from the late 19th century onwards. We also look here at what role the Iceland Commission and the Van Zyl Commission played in the history of our education here in Namibia. In 1949, the Iceland Commission was set up in South Africa. Its report in 1951 and the Bantu Education Act of 1953 formed the basis of education both in South Africa and later in Namibia. As the economy required an increasing number of literate people, state education for Africans was now increased. However, H.F. Verwoerd, who was South Africa's leading architect of apartheid, declared that education would always be separate, unequal, and designed to let Africans develop exclusively within their own communities. His idea of Christian national education had the following underlying philosophy, which of course was still based on an apartheid system. It was geared to ensure that all nations would guard their own identity by educating their children in the mother tongue and fostering in them a strong national and cultural identity. Then in 1958, the Van Zyl Commission introduced the system of Christian national apartheid-based education into Namibia. So it was taken out of the hands of the missionaries, who they felt could not be trusted to transmit the apartheid ideology correctly. Initially, education was administered along racial lines with a different system for white, black, and colored learners. So this then had a tremendous effect on the education. It still might be seen today, and that brings us to socio-economic challenges that are closely related to main problems and challenges facing the education system at the beginning of the 21st century in Namibia. So we cannot only look at the apartheid era and the colonialism, we must also look at some other problems we are facing as a country. And the first aspect we want to focus on is that we see many years after independence now, our country is still unable to provide adequate skilled human resources. And we also continue to experience high rates of unemployment and underemployment. Another aspect that's daunting is that our expenditure on education is not sustainable in the long run because we have low economic growth and increasing government budget deficits. Even if the educational sector receives the largest share of the government budget, over 80% goes to personnel costs and less than 20% is left for capacity building, educational materials and equipment, and other running costs. A third problem is that there's still a big need to improve the conditions for teaching and learning, especially in rural areas, to improve the quality of educational outcomes, particularly in the areas of mathematics, science, and English. We can try and partly achieve this by in-service training and support to teachers to acquire relevant competencies for effective teaching. In the fourth place, the Ministry of Basic Education is in the process of organizing and strengthening advisory service structures by establishing educator development and support units in all education regions. These are going hand in hand with the developing continuous professional development programs for advisory teachers and TRC managers, and also supporting their advanced studies for qualification upgrading purposes. So these are programs that are running in order to make a positive change in our education system. In the fifth place, there's a number of policies, all essential to the successful implementation of the EFA, which are developed and are in place. Yet there's still challenges in ensuring coordination of efforts toward their wide dissemination and implementation by all the stakeholders. In the sixth place, the intention is to provide for new models of learning and acquiring knowledge, with a conviction that education can contribute substantially towards creating responsible citizens who are able to build their own lives and make their own living. Here, the particular challenge is to reach out to the educationally marginalized, the impoverished, and those people that are living in the most remote areas of the country. Another problem that remains is the population growth that has been adversely affected by the worsening HIV and AIDS infection. It has led to many deaths specifically among the young productive age group, and this has resulted in a large number of children becoming orphans. To date, when the guide was written, they estimated that there were 70,000 HIV/AIDS orphans, but that number is bound to be more now. The number of education sector workers, of course this includes teachers, who are lost due to HIV/AIDS, also creates an additional challenge for the whole sector. Then we've got the influx of refugees that we had in Namibia. That means more and more refugee children, and the government is faced with a challenge there to provide them with quality education, not just to the children but the adults as well, since they have fundamental rights just as any other citizen. We come to another aspect, and that is that the government must make provision for all children, irrespective of their special educational needs, to benefit from the same education through mainstream education. But the thing is, these children with severe learning difficulties receive very few training because we don't have enough of these special schools. And in addition to that, there's a lot of barriers with regard to education of children with special needs, orphans and vulnerable children. Therefore, we have to see that an awareness is enforced to avoid negative attitudes and stereotypes. The challenge that we have here is that we have to train teachers and personnel to provide teaching and learning facilities to cater for the needs of children with special needs in mainstream schools. And I think, and as we all know, these things lack at this stage. Coupled with these challenges, government is faced with a daunting task of decentralizing functions to regions. The high unemployment rate, particularly among the youth, and the inadequate financial resources available to address these issues. Okay, we come to our next topic, which is for a better understanding of the current assessment system in teacher education. It's very important that we explore assessment practices in Namibia prior to independence in 1990. So let's have a look at what the state of formal education was in Namibia up to 1940. Education itself was segregated along racial and ethnic lines, as we also said previously. In 1921, under the South African mandate, education for whites in Namibia between the ages of 7 and 17 became compulsory. Until 1940, the government built only 2 primary schools for Africans. Both were in the central region of the country. In the northern part of Namibia, where the majority of the African population lived, no state schools were built. Christian national education in Namibia ensured that all nations would guard their own identity by educating their children in the mother tongue and fostering in them a strong national and cultural identity. And you can see this is a repetition of what I said previously. The apartheid education system was built upon these specific principles. Okay, now let's also look at the Bantu educational system and the Namibia literacy program. The apartheid regime of South Africa continued the unequal and oppressive educational system which the Germans handed down to them. The apartheid regime further ensured a racial segregation of the educational system to the detriment of the blacks. The apartheid educational system ensured that the state had an effective white control over the education of Africans for the promotion of ethnicity and ensuring of maintenance of educational facilities for Africans at a level much lower than those for the whites, which further gives us an insight into the oppressive Bantu educational system. It aimed at the subservience and the subjugation of the Africans on the one hand, but on the other hand, inculcation of racial bigotry as well. Thus, we can conclude that colonial and apartheid educational systems were what Ferrer variously described as domesticating, dehumanizing, as well as oppressive. It was particularly oppressive towards females. Girls and women were not encouraged to seek education, since the purpose of education was the production of laborers for the apartheid economy. Consequently, the majority of the illiterate population in Namibia then were females. It's also pertinent that the colonial administration almost totally neglected the area of adult and non-formal education. In 1971, the Namibia Literacy Program started as part of the Johannesburg-based Bureau of Literature and Literacy. In 1984, it was registered under the Company Act as the Namibia Literacy Program. Prior to this, adult and non-formal education were provided mainly by churches and SWAPO in exile. Then later in the early 1980s, NGOs established with the aim of supporting community development and providing some form of non-formal education could be seen. The combination of unequal provision, neglect and discrimination in the education of females in pre-independent Namibia set the stage for a predominantly illiterate female population in independent Namibia. At independence, the Namibian women were socially, politically, economically, psychologically and educationally brutalized, as well as dehumanized and disempowered. So that is quite a mouthful to consider when we think of female education in Namibia. And we come now to Unit 5, where we look at the major reform in pre-primary education after independence. And there are three sources that form the inspiration for the emergence of a global education reform movement. The first is the new paradigm of learning that became dominant in the 1980s. The second is the public demand to guarantee effective learning for all pupils. And the third was the accountability movement in education that has accompanied the global wave of the decentralization of public services. So these three sources inspired a total change in educational reform. Let's have a look at the three strong directions the global education reform movement emphasizes to improve quality, equity, and effectiveness of education. It shifts the focus, firstly in education, from what teachers should teach to what students should do and learn. So what does that mean? It means that we should address the need to understand learning as a process of making meaning and building understanding rather than seeing it as a recitation of facts and isolated knowledge. It also puts a strong accent on mastering the basic skills of reading, writing, mathematical and scientific literacy for almost all students by defining explicit learning targets for students and for teachers. In the second place, a common curriculum to ensure that irrespective of school or teachers, each student will be provided with appropriate learning environments. These environments must feature problem-solving, critical thinking, and cooperative learning. These types of deep learning are more compatible with the needs of a knowledge-based economy and the development of the network society than conventional models of learning. In the third place, we should also consider new and alternative forms of assessment which are linked to learning objectives. These will help both teachers and students to adjust their efforts to achieve the intended goals in schools. Assessment then becomes an integral part of the learning process, using a variety of approaches such as performance assessment, portfolio, as well as self-assessments. We spoke a lot about how females were disadvantaged in education, and that's why I feel it's very important that we look at the aspect of gender equity in the classroom with reference to providing flexibility in the approach to teaching and learning, and to provide learning experience which motivates the learner to learn more. So in the first place, all elective subjects in a school should be available for every learner, irrespective of the gender. The guiding criteria for the selection of subjects should be the interest, the aptitude and the ability of learners, and teachers must encourage the learners to study subjects across boundaries of conventional gender role stereotypes, and they should emphasize the advantages of doing so. The perceptions that girls are less able to succeed in mathematics and natural science, as well as girls' own self-perception of this nature, must be discussed openly and dealt with. The teacher should aim to play a positive role in terms of gender, being aware of how much attention and what sort of attention they pay to girls and boys respectively. Being aware of how girls and boys may react differently to certain types of behavior is important, such as ironic comments, a negative facial expression, harshness, and apparent indifferences. And then we should also address learners' own stereotyped attitudes and behaviors toward each other, especially, but not only, that of boys to girls is a strong influence. Teachers, in addition, must be sensitive to when it is advisable to intervene and take up gender issues arising from negative attitudes or conflict situations. In every subject, gender issues should be taken up explicitly. Learners should be encouraged to examine the stereotyped gender roles and behaviors, as also how they have arisen and been perpetuated, so that they can find positive role models in terms of gender equity. In the different subjects, the positive contributions that women have made and can make in areas of life where there has previously been male domination should be emphasized. Also, the value of men's participation in areas where there has previously been female domination, that should also be emphasized. Learners must be empowered to challenge and change role behaviors in themselves and others, which lead to any form of intimidation or violence, especially towards girls and women. And then all boys and girls, all people involved in education should understand the importance of mutual respect and equal sharing of practical work and caregiver responsibility in the home. This brings us to Unit 6, the factors and foundations that influence educational systems. Let's have a look at in terms of social goals, broad access and equity, how these can be best addressed through general education. General education is an effective vehicle to ensure that important social messages, for example, information about HIV/AIDS, are learned. In secondary education in particular, there are many positive externalities, for example, improved health, reduced infant mortality, and better family planning, HIV and AIDS prevention, and enhanced social participation. Also, more and better secondary education from girls contribute to the empowerment of women. Better quality education increases average earnings and productivity and reduces the likelihood of social problems that in turn are harmful to the economic development. The next aspect in Unit 6 is children in Namibia, which have been victims of war, poverty, overcrowded housing, inadequate food supply, polluted water, lack of sanitary facilities, and isolation. We want to look at this aspect and we want to evaluate the effect it has had and what role it still plays today. Children in our country have suffered from and still are suffering from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, acute respiratory infection, and measles, which are all preventable diseases. Although Namibia is one of the wealthiest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Namibia has a malnutrition level of 29%, which is only slightly lower than the average for the region, which is 31%. It also has the highest malnutrition level for any country in the world among the 83 countries whose GNP per capita income is higher than $1,000, according to the Social Science Division in 1995. A household health and nutrition survey conducted by UNICEF in the Northwest region and Katatura found a high to moderate malnutrition on a rate of 30% and a severe malnutrition rate at 6.8%. These statistics are quite shocking. Okay, and that what happens is the main influence of this situation is that the educational system is affected, and it should also play a role then on curriculum revision. So how can, in the light of the facts that we just considered, what can we do to incorporate aspects that need to be addressed in our curriculum? The formal school curricula are being revised to strengthen cross-curricular themes. So we are working in things on HIV and AIDS and health education, human rights and democracy, environmental education, informal communication technologies, entrepreneurial skills development, and other emerging issues to eliminate obsolete content and practices. Now that last highlighted bit means we want to eliminate practices and content that is no longer relevant, that can be removed, and we need to work in things that are relevant to our situation today. There's also then a strong focus on the acquisition of literacy, numeracy and life skills at lower primary level, and the curriculum has been streamlined to reflect that emphasis. At senior secondary level, it emphasizes the localization of the HEXI curriculum in order to ensure more relevance and local application. The teacher education curricula offered by the Colleges of Education and UNAM will be revised once the revision for the formal school system has been done, because this will ensure that the teacher education curricula will be aligned and responsive to the needs and the requirements of the school curricula. A next aspect, something in a totally different vein, is the importance of positive discipline in the classroom. How do we establish that, and why is it important? This can be established when there's a supportive atmosphere and when learners experience that work is challenging but also meaningful. Teaching and learning should be organized efficiently, and there should be punctuality. No time should be wasted, and you should ensure that all learners are motivated and on task. Proper learning, however, can only begin to take place when the learners are free from hunger, illness, tiredness, and fear. Any form of corporal punishment or physical or psychological intimidation opposes positive discipline and good learning conditions. When teaching and learning are well organized and managed, and there's appropriate learner-centered methods, then positive discipline is bound to result. Which 4 skills do we believe teachers should be equipped with? And these principles of skills are provided to us by NEED. In the first place, for good curriculum management at school level, all teachers should be fully up to date with the curriculum and its implications, the process of knowledge creation and teaching, learning and assessing in a learner-centered way. So we see teachers need to be well informed, they need to be up to date. In the second place, teachers must be appropriately qualified and also correctly placed to teach in the phase and subjects which they are allocated. In the third place, as far as possible, no teacher should be made to teach in a phase above the one they have qualified for, nor in a subject which they are not qualified or which they do not have the professional capacity for. And we know that these things are not always realistic. In the fourth place, all teachers should be competent in using ICTs to facilitate teaching and learning processes and in integrating them seamlessly in their education. Now that brings us to the end of the study guide, but I want to highlight and I want you to be able to define the following concepts as well. I've taken a few concepts from each unit which I want us to quickly run through and make sure that you do understand each of these. The first one is the term juvenile, which refers to a minor when it comes to matters of the law or a person prior to adulthood. The next is the term violation. Violation refers to a breach, an infringement, or a transgression of a law, a rule, or a promise. Then the next concept is charter. A charter is the grant of authority or rights, stating that the grantor formally recognizes the prerogative of the recipient to exercise the rights specified. So these terms are very important in Unit 3. Therefore, I thought it would be good if you would make sure you understand each of these. Then in Unit 6, I took out the following, the word reform. What does it refer to? To put or change into an improved form or condition, to amend or improve by change or color or removal of faults or abuses. Then the word globalization. It refers to a common term for processes of international integration arising from increasing human connectivity and interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. Further in Unit 6, I also highlighted the following, the word anthropology, which is the academic study of humanity, socialism, which is an economic system characterized by social ownership and cooperative management of the means of production, and a political philosophy advocating such a system. The word functionalism refers to a framework for building theory that sees society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote solidarity and stability. And then colonialism, which we frequently spoke about in this particular session, the establishment, maintenance, acquisition, and expansion of colonies in one territory by people from another territory. Constructivism. Constructivism is a learning process which allows a student to experience an environment firsthand, giving the student reliable, trustworthy knowledge. Then the concept of holism, which is an idea that natural systems and their properties should be viewed as wholes, not as collections or parts. Barriers to learning can be located within the learner, within the center of learning, within the education system, and within the broader social, economic, and political context. Can manifest in different ways when learners drop out of the system and when the excluded becomes visible. Sometimes it's possible to identify permanent barriers in the learner or system, which can be addressed through enabling mechanisms and processes. The term educational psychology, which is the study of how humans learn in educational settings, the effectiveness of educational interventions, the psychology of teaching, and the social psychology of schools as organization, also concerned with how students learn and develop, often focusing on subgroups, gifted children, and those subject to specific disabilities. Then the term mainstream schooling is very important. This refers to state schools or public schools, and it generally refers to primary or secondary schools offered to all children by the government, usually paid for in whole or part by public funding from taxation. But it may also refer to the institutions of post-secondary education funded in whole or in part and overseen by government. Okay. Then when we look at inclusive education, due to time constraints, I'm going to quickly run through these parts that you need to consider when we look at the term inclusive education. It's about the child's right to participate and the school's duty to accept the child. It rejects the use of special schools or classroom to separate students with disabilities from others. A premium is placed upon full participation by students with disabilities and upon the respect for their civil, social, and educational rights. And it also gives students with disabilities skills that they can use in and outside the classroom. That brings us to the end of our presentation this morning. What I want to end off with is just to caution you to always take into account the action verbs, because they will tell you which thinking levels are involved. If you see section 7 in the beginning of your study guide, please familiarize yourself with these action verbs. Then something important in this module, please make sure that you understand what you are learning. You can use this PowerPoint presentation as a starting point, but make your own summaries. Write out sentences, phrases of each of the topics that I discussed today, and make sure that you really understand what you are writing, what you are learning. And if you don't, find out what these words mean. Have your dictionary right next to you. Otherwise, it's going to become an impossible task to memorize all the facts. As I said there on the slide, try to restate things in your own words, but do not change the meaning. And when you answer longer questions in the exam, please keep this in mind. Write full, grammatically correct sentences as far as possible. Okay, my contact details, once again, I'm Isabel Bezuidenhout. Please send me an SMS on 081 251 2987 if you need me to call you. I'll phone you back at a time that is suitable for both you and me. As you know, we all have our different jobs and our responsibilities throughout the day, so I can't always take calls. If possible, sending an email is preferable, because then I can respond in my own time and I can respond more fully to whatever query you may have. Thank you very much, students, and I wish you all the best.